The galaxy was vast and silent, filled with billions of stars that burned quietly in the darkness, each one holding its own secrets. Civilizations lived and died under those stars, their voices like whispers lost in the endless void. Yet on this night, a sound cut through that silence. It was not a sound made of music or beauty. It was desperate. A broken voice carried on waves of static, like a scream trying to escape from the edge of death. The message was weak, almost lost inside the interference, but one word repeated again and again. Help. At first, no one wanted to listen. The great empires of the galaxy, with their shining fleets and endless wealth, turned their attention away. They feared that whoever called would bring danger with them. The cry might be a trap or a sign of an unstoppable enemy. Fear always made them silent, and so they ignored it. Planets continued their trade. Rulers sat in their palaces, and entire fleets floated idle while that desperate cry echoed again and again, unanswered. But there was one species that could not ignore it: humanity. The signal reached Earth, faint and broken, carried across impossible distances. When it was played inside the dark chamber of the Terran Council, the room fell still. Soldiers, diplomats, scientists, they all leaned closer as the static hissed through the speakers. Then came the voice, sharp and pleading, the sound of people who knew they would die if no one came. Even though it was not human, even though it spoke in tones alien and strange, there was pain inside it that everyone understood. It was the kind of pain only the desperate carry, the Council argued. Some voices said it was none of their concern. Humanity had survived too many wars already. Why risk everything for strangers? Others argued the opposite. They reminded everyone of what humanity once swore, that no cry for help would ever be ignored, because humans knew too well what it meant to scream into the void and be left to die. Old history still haunted them. Long ago, Earth had called for help and no one had answered. Humanity had survived that abandonment by its own strength, but the wound never closed. In the streets of Earth, the news spread. People whispered about the signal. It was played on small devices, shared across colonies, echoed in the steel corridors of space stations. The sound of that voice haunted those who listened to it. Some cried. Others clenched their fists. Humanity had seen war, suffering, hunger, and despair across centuries, but there was one thing that united them every time: the refusal to look away when someone else was in need. Still, fear remained. The signal carried no name, no origin, only fragments. In those fragments were terrible images: burning skies, ships turned to ash, cities swallowed by fire. There were shadows of creatures like nightmares, massive forms blotting out stars. Whoever was behind this destruction was powerful enough to silence entire worlds. The question rose in every mind. If others had ignored this call, perhaps they knew something humans did not. Perhaps this enemy was beyond even human strength. But humans were not like the other empires. Where others calculated risk, humans felt the pull of duty. They were reckless, yes, but their recklessness came from something deeper. Humanity had always believed in fighting for the hopeless, even when the fight seemed impossible. That belief had carried them through centuries of darkness, and now it rose again. The Terran Council gathered one final time before the decision was made. Silence hung heavy inside the chamber. The hologram of the signal floated above them, the broken face of an alien filled with terror. The voice repeated, "Help, help, help." And then the council leader spoke. His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of centuries. If no one else will answer, humanity will. We cannot turn away. Not this time. Not ever. The decision spread across the colonies like fire. Fleet commanders were called. Engineers woke from rest and went to their stations. Old shipyards, silent for decades, began to come alive again. The hum of engines filled the dark as the first preparations began. Humanity was moving, not because it was safe, not because it was wise, but because it was the right thing to do. Yet in that same moment, a quiet tension gripped the galaxy. Other empires watched from the shadows. They whispered to each other in their halls of power. The humans had heard the cry and they had chosen to act. Some called it foolish, some called it brave. But all of them remembered what humanity was capable of when pushed. The galaxy had seen human war before. It had seen the firestorms, the relentless charges, the battles that should have been lost but were won through sheer will. And now that will was awakening once more. On the edge of human space, inside the command deck of the First Fleet, a young officer listened to the signal one last time. He closed his eyes and clenched his jaw. He had never met these aliens, did not even know what they looked like, but their cries felt familiar, like echoes of humanity's own past. He whispered into the silence, not knowing if anyone would hear, "We are coming." And somewhere far across the galaxy, that broken signal continued to play. A dying people screamed for salvation, their voices fading into the dark. They did not know it yet, but someone had finally listened. Humanity had heard their cry, and humanity was preparing to answer. Would their answer be enough? Or would the galaxy swallow both the weak and the strong in fire? The stars did not say. They only waited. The cry had been heard, and the decision was made. Humanity would answer. But what awaited them in the depths of the galaxy was far more dangerous than they had imagined. As the fleet assembled, the Terran leaders studied the fragments of data they had collected. The signal was coming from a system at the galaxy's edge, a place long forgotten by most. Once a thriving star system, it had now fallen silent, its planets reduced to ashes. What remained was a blackened reminder of something worse than death. The enemy was not what they expected. It wasn't a fleet of ships or a race of conquerors. It was something far older and more terrifying. The data they had received spoke of an ancient species, one that had existed long before the rise of the empires and the great civilizations. They had been lost to history, forgotten in the wake of time. Until now. The first clues came from the scattered remnants of a once thriving colony. Survey teams were dispatched, but the reports that came back were chilling. Whole cities had been wiped out in a matter of hours. The survivors, what few there were, spoke of creatures that seemed to be made of the very shadows of the stars. They were not just warriors. They were predators, ancient beings that fed on more than just flesh. They consumed entire civilizations, devouring everything in their path. The Terran commanders were no fools. They knew the galaxy had its share of powerful species, but none like this. These creatures were ancient. Their technology was not based on the same principles humanity had known. It was dark, alien in ways that defied understanding. The Terrans' first instinct was to respond with their own power, to bring their fleets to bear against this threat. But the more they uncovered, the more they realized the true nature of the enemy. This enemy did not fear death. They thrived in it. The survivors spoke of mass sacrifices, of entire worlds falling before them without even a struggle. And the worst part was yet to come. These creatures were not just killing for conquest. They were preparing for something. The galaxy was but a means to an end. They were gathering forces, building something that could not yet be fully understood. With every report that came in, the danger grew clearer. The human fleet had been preparing for battle, but they had not prepared for this. The enemy's fleet was not composed of mere ships, but of living vessels, creatures that combined flesh and metal, biological ships that could heal themselves in the heat of battle. And their weapons were not traditional. They were weapons of fear, of darkness, things that turned their enemies' own minds against them. The human fleet was not yet fully ready, but there was no turning back. The cry for help had been heard, and the Terrans would answer. It was too late to turn back. In the command centers across Earth, preparations were pushed forward at breakneck speed. Soldiers were briefed, ships were outfitted, and the Terran leadership stood in front of the vast fleet, knowing that this fight was not just about survival. It was about answering a call that would echo throughout history. Despite all the preparations, a growing fear began to settle over the officers in charge of the Terran warships. The signal had already shown them the galaxy's response to this ancient threat. Silence. No one had dared to help the dying worlds. No one had come to their aid. It was as though the entire galaxy feared what lay beyond the edges of known space. They had all turned their backs. But humanity had not. Humanity was coming to face what had been forgotten, to confront the shadows of the past and bring the fight to those who thought they could never be challenged. However, deep in the dark expanse of space, something stirred. The ancient enemy was watching. They had seen the human ships moving. They had seen the humans rallying, preparing to strike. And to them this was the final test. Would the humans be the ones to break the silence, or would they be consumed like all the others before them? The predator species had no interest in merely fighting for dominance. They were not motivated by hunger alone. They had a purpose, one that had driven them across millennia of darkness. Their fleet was not a tool for conquest, but a means to an end. They were building something, preparing for something far beyond the destruction of mere worlds. The alien fleets did not operate in the same manner as human ships. They did not follow the same rules of combat. Theirs was a dark science, a blending of the biological and the mechanical. Their ships could phase in and out of reality, making them nearly impossible to track. Their weapons, too, were unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. These were weapons of pure terror, things that could break the mind, unravel the very essence of a soul. As humanity's ships made their way toward the forgotten star system, a feeling of unease settled over the fleet. They had come this far, but what if they were not prepared for the darkness that awaited them? The commanders, though experienced, could not shake the feeling that they were walking into something far older and more powerful than they could ever understand. Still, the decision had been made. The war fleet moved forward. Humanity was moving toward the heart of the unknown, toward a battle unlike any they had fought before. But what lay ahead was not just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything they believed in. And as the first wave of human ships entered the dark system, a single thought echoed in the minds of every soldier. Could they truly face the forgotten enemy? Or would they become just another story lost in the shadows of time? The decision was final. There was no turning back. As humanity's war fleet moved deeper into the unknown, there was an overwhelming sense of both fear and determination. The Council's orders had been clear. The fleet would answer the cry for help. The rest of the galaxy might stand silent, but humanity would not look away. This wasn't just about saving others, it was about redemption, proving to the stars that humanity still had a place in this galaxy, that they would fight for the helpless, even if no one else would. Inside the command center on Earth, officers sat hunched over their monitors, eyes glued to the live feed as it flickered with transmissions from the warships. Each ship was a beacon of humanity's strength. Yet beneath that metal exterior, the crew knew the truth. They were entering a fight that could end in disaster. The fleet had not seen combat of this scale in generations. Wars had been fought before, yes, but this was different. The enemy they were heading toward wasn't just some new adversary to be defeated. It was an ancient darkness, a force that had destroyed worlds before, and might very well do so again. The fleet was a masterpiece of human engineering. Massive ships built to carry soldiers, weapons and resources for a long journey. But this war wouldn't be won with size alone. The enemy they were facing could not be measured in mere numbers. They would need something more. They would need every ounce of human willpower, every shred of their resilience to survive the nightmare ahead. But as the human ships moved further into the void, whispers began to spread. A sense of doubt crept into the ranks. Were they truly ready? Was this the right choice? Every ship was preparing to engage in battle, but none of the commanders could shake the feeling that they were marching into the unknown, marching into a place where the very laws of combat might not apply. Was it possible that their technological superiority could be outmatched by the ancient darkness they faced? Captain Anders, one of the fleet's most experienced commanders, stared at the screen in front of him. He had been through countless battles, had seen the horrors of war up close. But the information coming through the feed was enough to shake even his hardened resolve. The enemy wasn't just a physical force. It was a force that could unravel the very fabric of reality. Their ships could phase in and out of space, their weapons could break minds, and they were driven by a purpose beyond mere conquest. He had faced enemies before that tested his limits, but this was different. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The lives of thousands, perhaps millions, hung in the balance. He turned to his crew, his eyes hardened with the burden of leadership. We know what we're up against. They aren't like anything we've ever fought. They will test everything we believe. But we are humanity and we do not back down. His words, though resolute, were not enough to silence the doubts that lingered. They all knew the risks. Humanity was entering a war they didn't understand, facing an enemy they couldn't truly comprehend. They were not prepared for the psychological warfare the enemy could unleash. And yet, in that moment, something else stirred within them, a force greater than fear. It was hope. It was humanity's instinct to fight for the helpless, to rise to the challenge even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As the fleet moved closer to the enemy's star system, humanity's warships began to change. It wasn't just the ship's physical upgrades. It was the mentality of the crew. The shift in how they viewed the battle ahead. They were not just soldiers. They were humanity's answer to the universe's silence. Their mission was no longer just about defense, it was about making a statement. They were humanity, and they would not let the galaxy fall to the dark forces that threatened it. Inside the control rooms, commanders and officers worked tirelessly. Strategies were drawn up, plans were made, and every possible outcome was considered. There were debates over which planets would be targeted first, which tactical formations would best serve their fleet. But through it all, one thing remained constant. Humanity was going to fight. They were going to fight for the people who had called out, for the lives that had been lost, and for the future of every world that could still be saved. The Terran fleet wasn't the largest in the galaxy, nor was it the most advanced. But it had something the others lacked, an unshakable determination. Where other empires might hesitate, humanity had always acted. They were the species that had once looked at the stars and decided they belonged there. They were the ones who had sent out their voices to space, to prove they could conquer the void. And now, as they approached the ancient enemy's home system, they would do it again. But the decision to fight wasn't made lightly. The enemy they were up against wasn't just a threat to humanity. It was a threat to everything the galaxy had built. It was an assault on every civilization that had risen in peace, on every people that had worked together to build something greater than themselves. And yet, in the face of this overwhelming darkness, humanity stood firm. Because that was the nature of humankind. When everything seemed lost, they stood up. When the galaxy turned its back, they looked ahead. As the fleet neared the dark system, Captain Anders stood before the command console, his hand resting on the screen. The images of the enemy ships flickered before him. Massive living vessels, each one seemingly more monstrous than the last. He felt his heart rate rise, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't, not now. The time for doubt had passed. Humanity had made its choice. They would face the darkness head-on, and if they were to fall, they would do so fighting with everything they had. The decision had been made, and now all that was left was to face the consequences. As the human fleet entered the orbit of the dying star system, a single thought echoed through the minds of every soldier, officer, and captain aboard those ships. We are humanity. We do not back down. The silence of space seemed to stretch on forever, as if even the stars themselves were holding their breath. Humanity's war fleet, a colossal armada built from years of preparation, drifted steadily towards the heart of the enemy's star system. The ships, once dormant in the vast, quiet shipyards of Earth, now cut through the darkness like a blade, sleek, deadly, and unstoppable. As the fleet entered the system's outermost orbit, the commanders on board knew they were stepping into a firestorm. The moment of truth had come. Inside the command center, every officer, every soldier, every engineer, and every pilot was acutely aware of what they were about to face. It wasn't just a battle. It was a test of everything humanity had built, everything it had fought for. The warships stretched out before them like a wall of steel and fire, their hulls gleaming under the light of distant stars. They were not the largest fleet in the galaxy, nor were they the most advanced, but they were united in their purpose. They had come to end the silence. They had come to fight the darkness that threatened to swallow the galaxy whole. The enemy, as they now knew, was a force unlike any humanity had encountered before. Their ships were not merely machines but living vessels, beasts that seemed to pulse with dark energy, shifting and adapting to every threat they faced. The predators had the ability to phase in and out of reality, making them nearly impossible to track, much less defeat. Their weapons were not just weapons of war. They were tools of terror, designed to shatter the mind and break the will of their enemies, and yet, despite the odds, despite the overwhelming fear that lingered in every corner of the fleet, humanity pushed forward. The Terran fleet was built on more than just metal and firepower. It was built on something stronger. It was built on the relentless will to survive, the undying hope that no matter the challenge, humanity would never surrender. The first shots were fired in silence. The fleet moved into position, each ship aligning perfectly with the others, forming a deadly line that cut through the dark expanse of space. The command to fire came quickly, swift, precise, without hesitation. The guns of the human warships unleashed their fury in a single coordinated blast. Waves of plasma and energy shot out from the hulls of the ships, lighting up the darkness like a new dawn breaking over a dead world. The first enemy ship appeared from the darkness. A shadow among shadows, it emerged from a rift in space, its shape indistinct, shifting, barely visible to the human sensors. It was a living ship, a grotesque creation that seemed to pulse and breathe like an animal. Before humanity could fire again, the ship's tendrils lashed out, reaching for the nearest human vessel. The warship shuddered as it was pulled into the rift, vanishing into the darkness in the blink of an eye. A chill ran through the fleet. The human ships were powerful, but this enemy was something else entirely. They could not simply be shot at and destroyed. These creatures fought not with brute force, but with a terrifying mastery of space itself. They were not just invaders. They were shadows, slipping between the cracks of reality, playing with the fabric of time and space like a cat with its prey. The first wave of the Terran fleet held firm, their weapons trained on the unknown, their resolve hardening with every passing second. Captain Anders, standing on the command deck of the lead ship, watched the chaotic battle unfold. His mind raced, calculating, adjusting. The enemy ships were fast, almost impossible to track. But they had one vulnerability: they couldn't be everywhere at once. Target their ships on the edges first, Anders barked, his voice cold but steady. We'll isolate them, force them to fight us in small groups. His crew worked quickly, following his orders with practiced precision. The fleet began to divide, breaking into smaller formations, each ship moving in sync with the others, firing as one. It was then that the enemy showed its true power. A massive ship, more monstrous than the others, appeared from the depths of space. Its hull was black, slick like oil, and covered in strange runes that seemed to shift as the ship moved. The creature, if it could be called that, floated towards the human fleet, its very presence bending the light around it. As it closed the distance, the humans realized what they were up against. This wasn't just a ship, it was a living entity. A god of war born from the darkest corners of the universe. The human fleet opened fire, unleashing everything they had. Plasma cannons, railguns, missiles. Every weapon at their disposal was used in a desperate attempt to break the creature's defenses. For a moment, the enemy ship seemed to stagger, its massive form twisted and flickered, as if it were about to be torn apart by the barrage. But then it healed. Slowly, impossibly, the ship began to regenerate, its wounds sealing themselves as though it had never been hit. And that's when they realized the enemy wasn't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to consume. The creatures didn't just want to win this battle. They wanted to break the spirit of the humans, to prove that no matter how hard they fought, they could not escape the inevitable. But humanity had faced worse odds before. They had survived wars, disease, famine, and death. They had faced enemies that were stronger, faster, and more ruthless, and every time they had found a way to push back. This battle would be no different. Captain Anders tightened his grip on the railing, watching as the massive alien ship came closer. "Hold steady," he said to his crew. "We are humanity. We do not fall." As the alien ships closed in, the battle raged on, and humanity's war fleet began to unleash everything it had. Every ounce of firepower, every bit of strategy, every piece of human ingenuity was thrown into the fray. The fight was far from over, but there was one truth that remained. Humanity had not come to the edge of space to die. They had come to fight. As the human fleet engaged the enemy with everything they had, the galaxy watched from the shadows. Some feared what humanity would unleash. Others feared what would happen if humanity failed. But in that moment, one thing was certain. The galaxy would never forget the day humanity unleashed its war fleet. The battle raged on, with flashes of light and fire illuminating the vast expanse of space. The human fleet had launched everything they had at the ancient enemy. And still, the shadows of the predators continued to loom, their living ships regenerating with terrifying speed. The moment the humans thought they were gaining ground, the creatures would adapt, heal, and retaliate with a brutality that sent chills down the spine of every officer on board. Yet despite all the fear, there was something undeniable in the air. Humanity would not retreat. Captain Anders stood on the command deck of the flagship, staring at the chaotic battlefield unfolding before him. His mind raced as he watched the massive alien vessels phase in and out of reality, appearing and disappearing with terrifying ease. The enemy wasn't just an adversary. They were a force of nature, a living embodiment of the galaxy's darkest fears. But humanity had something they did not: the unwavering will to fight back no matter the odds. "Keep pushing forward," Anders ordered, his voice cold but resolute. "We're not retreating, not now. Not ever." His words echoed through the command center, and for a moment there was a sense of unity that ran deeper than the fear that gripped them all. The human fleet had come to this point knowing full well that they might not survive. Yet each soldier, each officer, each pilot carried a single unshakable truth. They were fighting for something greater than themselves. The alien fleet, while terrifying, had one flaw. It was not invincible. Humanity's relentless attacks had begun to wear them down. Slowly, piece by piece, the Predator's living ships began to break. Their regenerative abilities weren't infinite. Every blow they sustained, every shot that landed, left them weaker, vulnerable in ways that the Predators had never anticipated. But the Terran fleet was far from unscathed. Casualties mounted on both sides. Ships burned, crew members lost, their lives swallowed by the void. The cost of this war was becoming clearer by the second, but still, the humans fought. They fought because they had no choice. They fought because no one else would. The galaxy had watched, silent and afraid, while the Predators tore through helpless worlds. But humanity had answered the call. As the hours stretched into what felt like days, the human fleet found itself in a battle of attrition. But they had a trick up their sleeve, a secret weapon that had been hidden within their fleets for years. Humanity's greatest advantage wasn't in their ships nor in their weapons. It was their ability to adapt, to learn, to innovate in the heat of battle. The key to victory lay not in brute force but in strategy. The Terran fleet commander, Admiral Marlowe, was the first to recognize it. As he studied the battlefield, he noticed something strange. The Predators' ships, despite their ability to phase through space, were still bound by certain limitations. They couldn't maintain their unnatural shifting forever. Each time they phased in and out of existence, they left behind a subtle but noticeable distortion in the fabric of space. It was a crack in their armor, one that humanity could exploit. With the realization came action. The human ships began to alter their tactics, focusing fire on the distortions left behind when the enemy phased. Plasma cannons, railguns, and missiles fired with pinpoint accuracy, targeting the cracks in the Predators' seemingly invulnerable vessels. The first few shots had no effect, but then, one ship, a massive Predator vessel, began to falter. It flickered in and out of existence, its form distorting like a mirage. Then with a final agonizing screech, it fell silent. The crack in its defenses had been exploited, and the ship tore apart, its living parts shriveling and crumbling into nothingness. Humanity had found their vulnerability. Admiral Marlowe's voice rang through the comms as the Terran fleet pushed forward, the first glimmer of hope shining through the chaos. Target the distortions. We've got this. Keep up the pressure. The human ships responded in perfect unison, their weapons tearing into the Predators' ships with renewed vigor. It was a relentless barrage, and with each ship they destroyed, humanity grew bolder. No longer were they fighting for survival alone. They were fighting for the galaxy, fighting to show that no enemy, no matter how ancient or terrifying, could destroy humanity's spirit. But as the enemy began to fall back, a new threat emerged from the heart of the Predator fleet. The largest ship humanity had encountered yet, a colossal being of darkness, slowly came into view. It was unlike anything they had seen before, a swirling mass of energy and metal, its surface alive with pulsing veins of light. It was the leader, the source of the destruction, the very heart of the Predator's war effort. It was a being that existed not only in space but in time itself. It was a manifestation of the ancient darkness that had consumed entire galaxies, and now it was coming for humanity. "Brace for impact," Captain Anders said, his voice tight with the weight of the moment. "This is it. Everything we've fought for comes down to this." The human fleet had no more tricks left, no more plans. It was time for the final battle. The Predator leader loomed large on their sensors, its weapons locked and aimed. The fleet began to move into formation, readying themselves for the most desperate strike they had ever made.